Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You will have recognized, most of you, I would think, this memorable waltz that I played as the theme of one of the greatest sets of variations in the history of music, the 33 variations by Beethoven on a theme of Diabelli. Anton Diabelli was a distinguished Viennese editor and music publisher and composer of some renown himself, who first came to prominence by championing the works of Franz Schubert, placing a really strong bet on his future, one of the first. In 1819, Diabelli had the inspired idea to send his waltz around to every composer he knew, or every known composer of the time, in order that every one of them might write a variation and contribute to this kind of patriotic anthology of Austrian music that he would rather pompously entitle the Vaterländischer Künstlerverein, so the kind of the artists' society of the fatherland, of the homeland. And indeed, he published, this is the title page of that famous collection. Now, in what would have to rank as one of the greatest bargains, certainly in music history, Diabelli received in due course not one, but 33 variations from Beethoven. And there were so many of them, and they were so great, and it was so much music that he published them as part one. So the whole part one of the proposed anthology was just Beethoven. But part two consisted of contributions from everybody else, and it was precisely 50 composers. Curious number whether that's how many responded or he rounded it off, but it was exactly 50 that we have in part two. And among them, Karl Czerny, Franz Schubert. I love this one, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart in 1820. If you look really closely, it says, in parentheses, Fils, the son of Mozart. Of course, it wasn't Wolfgang Amadeus, he was Klaus, I think. But anyway, the Mozart name is there, and it was Mozart the son. Actually, the 8-year-old Franz Liszt contributed. Well, let's see if this thing is falling asleep. The next slide is, if we can get this to wake up. The next slide is supposed to, there we go. It's supposed to show us Liszt. And so Liszt was 8 years old, but wrote this little charming variation also. Amongst these luminaries was a mysterious contribution in the form of a 4-part fugue from a certain, maybe somebody can advance this for me because this isn't working, from a certain SRD. Let me play this fugue for you. As you will hear shortly, the fugue is based on the bass line of Diabelli. and try again. Let's see. This one works. So this finely crafted, virtuosic, very difficult and awkward, uncomfortable, remarkably original fugue was indeed written by SRD, Serenissimus Rudolphus Dux. That is Rudolph Johann Joseph Rainer, Archduke of Austria and Archbishop of Olmütz. So who was Archduke Rudolph? The basics, I think, are known to all lovers of and students of Beethoven. He was born in 1788, so about 17, 18 years Beethoven's junior, to the ultimate heritage, the imperial house of Habsburg, nephew, son, brother, and uncle to emperors, although never emperor himself. He was orphaned at 4 years old when his parents, Emperor Leopold II and Empress Maria Louisa, were both died. A lot of speculation, still unresolved how that happened, but both died in a space of weeks, and so he was left to be raised by, I think, by his uncle. By the way, Leopold II, of course, is a brief reign in the history of the Habsburgs, but important for us in music, if only because it was for his coronation that Mozart wrote his final great opera, La Clemenza di Tito. And opera lovers among you know that that great work is being revived at the Met just now in these weeks. And if you haven't seen it, go and see it because it's astonishing. And that's the classic Ponell production. Anyway, Leopold II was his father. So as Rudolph matured, he himself became a patron of the arts, especially of music, and particularly, of course, of Beethoven. Their first meeting was in 1803, 1804. We don't have an exact date, but it was around that time when Rudolph was about 15 years old, and Beethoven had already heard everything about this Wunderkind because Rudolph was a tremendous pianist. So much so that even Beethoven knew and was keen to hear him and to meet him. And indeed, he was very impressed when he finally did hear him then with his piano playing. And so he studies with Beethoven, first as pianist, which was already a fairly exclusive club, but then composition. Here we have, that's Rudolph at that age. And you see the kind of close-up, just such an interesting face, and those beautiful hands in that portrait that, again, may have had something to do with his pianistic abilities. Now, very soon after they met, Beethoven dedicated for the first time a work to Rudolph. This is, you may not be able to see the small print, but take my word for it, that's the title page of the fourth concerto, dedicated to Rudolph. So Beethoven begins to teach him composition. And it's interesting not only in what it says about Rudolph's abilities, but because Beethoven never taught composition to anyone. Piano, begrudgingly to a few students, as we know. Composition, this was his first and last composition student. So in that same fateful 1809, very soon after they met, Beethoven famously dedicates his Opus 81 sonata, Das Lebewohl, to Rudolph. We'll talk about that more a little later. In general, he would dedicate many of his greatest works to this man. Okay, so Rudolph is then, fast forward to 1819, he's appointed archbishop. I think we have a picture of that. And that's upon his ordination or installation as archbishop. Interesting what variety we see in his, it seems to me, in his expressions and in his kind of visage from over the course of his brief life. He outlived Beethoven by only 4 years. He was dead at 43. While he was interred in the imperial crypt in Vienna, as befitted his high stature and members of his royal blood. But as an archbishop, he wanted his heart to stay in his archbishopric. And so his heart was removed, and it was placed, and I think it's still there. There we go. The Cathedral of St. Wenceslas in Olmütz. It's in modern-day Czechia, and that's where his heart remains. Rudolph, of course, was one of many noblemen who patronized Beethoven and supported him financially and in other ways. These are some very famous names. Their pictures may not be as familiar to you, so just a quick scroll through the gallery of Beethoven's friends and patrons. This is Joseph Lobkowitz. This is Karl Lichnowsky. These are all princes. Ferdinand Kinsky, Nikolai Golitsyn, of course, the famous Razumovsky, Andrei Razumovsky, and there were others. You see Beethoven performing famously in these salons with all the good of, or certainly the great of that world there to admire him and to be close to him. But this man, this Archduke, and again we see a quite different visage here, he was different somehow, this Archduke who became Archbishop. Something crucial to know about his life is that his own performing career, just as Beethoven's, was crippled by disease. In Beethoven's case, of course, by his waxing deafness. In the case of Rudolph, by terrible rheumatism, which coupled with the epilepsy, which he had suffered from since his early childhood, became impossible to sustain performing. And so he gives up piano to focus on composing. So his composing, something very few people know about, and he wrote in various genres, for the piano, for the clarinet, for other woodwind instruments, for the violin. He only published 3 works in his lifetime. The fugue that you just heard, published under that SRD, a clarinet sonata, and this very ambitious set of 40 variations on a theme Beethoven had given him as a composition study. The theme is called O Hoffnung, not to be confused with the similar song by the same name. Beethoven, this is something else. An die Hoffnung, this is O Hoffnung. 4-bar theme that he wrote, 40 variations, and a great grand fugue to cap it off, and sort of in Beethoven's coming style, if you will. So we have here a beautiful picture, or a beautiful thought behind the picture, which is that Beethoven was so enamored of this work that he not only wanted it published and helped it to be published, but he said, why don't you say that this is written by my student on the title page? And so it says that is dedicated to Beethoven. You see that von seinem Schüler, by his student. And again, there's a kind of a transparent pseudonym. It says R.E.H., Rudolph Erzherzog, so Archduke Rudolph, but it doesn't quite exactly say who it is. So it's, I guess, for those in the know. Very, very wonderful that Beethoven had that approach. And this work, if you want to delve further into Rudolph, is considered by people who know his music really to be his most important work. And Beethoven called it a masterpiece, which again, if it was even half meant, means a lot to us. There was also a violin sonata. There are numerous sets of variations. And I have to mention this, there are 7 quartets, very well written with an understanding of the idiom of these instruments, for clarinet, viola, bassoon, and guitar. And as far as I know, not before or since has that combination been traduced, but he did. Obviously, members of his retinue were skilled in those instruments, and he wrote very well for these 7 pieces for that unusual combination. One more thing to mention about his life is that he was an avid collector of music. First of all, that meant scores, but also books on music and anything to do with gathering knowledge. It's said that he began collecting at 13 years old. By age 30, it's noted that his collection represented 1,200 composers. And by the time of his death, more than double that, 2,400 composers. So just a little basic math tells us that that's a new composer every 5 days added to his collection over 30 years. And I think any of us can build up a collection of 100 composers quickly. Maybe 2,400. Remarkable. And he really knew his collection. He knew what was in it. It wasn't just for show. It was for his study and for his benefit. And a remarkable feature of it was that he took painstaking care in cataloging it. by alphabet, by genre, by instrument, and so forth. And so we have here something to look at. Sorry to keep you in suspense each time, but I think it's coming. This, for example, this was all handwritten, and sorry the images aren't more blown up, but you can get a sense of his beautiful handwriting. And in this case, it's 46 different settings of In questa tomba oscura, which was a famous text then by Carpani, including set by Beethoven and other, Schubert said it. 46 settings, and where they're located and where he can, so he wants to compare, he can do that. Here's another example. You come to M in his catalog of just the basic catalog of works. Under M, of course, Mozart, Pride of Place, and you see how beautifully he organizes by genre all of Mozart's works, or all the ones he had. And then in the middle column, those of you, if you have good eyes, you can see concerto. And so those are the piano concerti, most of them, with thematic incipits. And so they must have meant a great deal to him naturally as a pianist. And so he wanted to know exactly which one was which. One more picture I'd like to show you from his catalog, where instead of simply recording the entries, he's painted an elaborate, beautiful bookcase. And on the bottom you can see, if it's not obscured by the piano, you can see a parquet floor. And so this is all very realistic painting. And so this beautiful portrait bookcase sits on the floor. And inside the bookcase is the catalog, except that each entry is in the form of a spine. So it's vertical and it's made to look like a book, but if you look closely, that shows you exactly where I can find that book or that score. And so there's pages and pages and volumes of these beautiful bound volumes that we have from Rudolph. I just think that how much one must have loved books. And by the way, this is every subject imaginable, not only music and the great treatises and beginnings of biographies of composers. It's everything to do with human knowledge. How much you must have loved that to gone to this much trouble to really be able to think about what he has and to keep learning from it. Let's return to Beethoven, though, because, of course, it's his relationship with Rudolph that most interests us. The ancient proverb reminds us, tell me who your friends are, and I'll tell you who you are. And surely that Rudolph numbered Beethoven among his close friends is tremendously revealing. Here are some nuggets illuminating, I hope, their interrelations. Rudolph's aforementioned music collection was an invaluable resource for Beethoven, who constantly borrowed scores of his own music when he needed it. And so we have letters. He borrowed the Horn Sonata, which admittedly was written sometime earlier, Opus 17. He borrowed the Opus 70 trios. He borrowed the Seventh Symphony. He said, I don't have a score. I need a score of my Seventh Symphony. Please, can you send it over? So that was kind of just a lending, I think is the word, right? Lending library that was available to him because Rudolph took good care. He writes about Rudolph something that I think any person, any musician would give an arm and a leg that Beethoven would say this about us. Just a short quote. He lives and has his being in music. Doesn't say that he's an important connection for me, or it's networking, or it's a source of income. He lives and has his being in music. He did take his teaching duties very seriously, and when Rudolph came to Vienna, usually for weeks at a time, he would teach him 3 hours a day. And he also writes about how exhausting these lessons are. I don't think in a pejorative sense, but in the sense that he puts in so much to these teaching and to working with him that then it's hard for him to regroup and to compose later that same day. So these lessons take a lot out of Beethoven as well. From a letter to Rudolph, just helping guide his student. It's quite some charming details here. Just a short quote. Beethoven, I hope that your Imperial Highness will continue to acquire special practice in writing down your ideas straight away at the piano. For this purpose, there should be a small table next to the piano. Not only is the imagination strengthened in this way, but one also learns to pin down the remotest ideas at once. I thought that was a wonderful quote. And personally, not being a composer, but I was struck by this notion that the imagination is strengthened by writing down as opposed to confined. One thinks, oh, just let it loose and just let your fantasy. No, to strengthen the imagination, write down these ideas. And of course, Beethoven so famously was constantly writing down these snippets of unformed germs that would become great ideas and huge canvases. Beethoven made detailed but subtle corrections to Rudolph's drafts. And as mentioned, he took obvious pride in the publication of his pupils' works. A remarkable example of this is the painstaking editing of that set of 40 variations on O Hofno. I have a picture of it here. Look at the detail in Beethoven's attentive review. The X's, as usual with Beethoven, it's hard to make out anything, but when you spend enough time with him, you start to see things. And the X's are what he also used in his own corrections. Those are the places where, almost like a marginal note for an editor, and then you look to see what's the problem. What's fascinating about these corrections is two things. One is the care that Beethoven takes. 40 variations, that's many pages of score, and he went through it twice at a different time. And the second point is that the corrections are very technical. They're subtle. They're to do with hidden, those of you who know about these things, direct octaves, but they're hidden, and so it's not an obvious error, but it's something that Beethoven would not miss. Corrections, suggestions about chord spacing. This chord, the harmony is fine, but maybe voice it like this, space it like this. So really on a high level, and Beethoven may be surprising from those of us who are used to thinking of him as overbearing and impatient and domineering. Beethoven does not try to overhaul Rudolph's structures or to change the architecture, but just to say, fine-tune this, fine-tune that, think about this. Well, he not only valued Rudolph's compositions, he liked his piano playing to such an extent that he entrusted him with the premieres, the public premieres of several of his works, including the piece you're about to hear, the Piano and Violin Sonata, Opus 96. It was not only dedicated to Rudolph, but Rudolph himself gave the premiere in December of 1812. Of course, the dedications. Beethoven dedicated to only 3 composers in his life. Schumann, Mendelssohn, dedicated, it seems, to anybody, anybody and everybody. Beethoven dedicated to Haydn, the 3 trios, Opus 1. That's, of course, we all know that, and Haydn liked the first 2 and wasn't sure about the C minor. He dedicated to Antonio Salieri, which certainly must speak well of Salieri, the 3 sonatas, Opus 12, for piano and violin. And then the 3rd composer to whom he dedicated was Rudolph. And what dedications? Just to remind you of a couple of them. Opus 81A, so this famous sonata Das Lebewohl, which was unfortunately published as Les Adieux, which Beethoven thought was far too frivolous a title for what felt to be a final farewell. It's April 1809. It's exactly 210 years ago, right now, and these same middle of April days is when action is starting to unfold in the Franco-Austrian War, and Rudolph has to leave. And so Beethoven composes this magnificent first movement, Das Lebewohl, and brings it to Rudolph, gives him the score, dedicated in a most unusual personal way, not just to and from. It says, written from the heart. And that's his inscription to my friend, or to his Imperial Highness, but written from the heart from Beethoven. He gives it, and Rudolph leaves, and then Abwesenheit, absence, is written during those months of absence that could have been longer. Again, in retrospect, we know he comes back, and when he comes back, then Das Wiedersehen, the return or the reunion, forms the 3rd movement of that famously sort of programmatic Beethoven sonata. Then the Missa Solemnis has a similar dedication, personal dedication from Beethoven. The Missa Solemnis is not only dedicated to Rudolph, but may not have come to be were it not for his previously mentioned installation as Archbishop of Olmütz. And when Beethoven finds out this grand news, he says, I will write just the piece for that event. And of course, he was 3 years late. So it did not sound then, but it eventually did sound. And thank goodness that we have what was, for many people, Beethoven's most sublime masterwork. Of course, the extraordinary piano trio, Opus 97, which also you will hear tonight after intermission. It's a piece that's so closely associated with Rudolph that it's simply known as the Archduke Trio, or even just the Archduke. I'm playing the Archduke, I'm playing this piece. So, what are these 15 dedications? I'm not going to list them all, but just to say that they're not just any pieces. Opus 96, Violin Sonata, Opus 97, Trios, Missa Solemnis, Piano Sonata, Opus 81A, but also Piano Sonata, Opus 106, the Hammerklavier, Piano Sonata, Opus 111, that sublime final sonata. A piece for string quartet that you may know, Grosse Fuge, dedicated to Rudolph. And on and on. So his greatest string quartet, if you will, it's one movement, but it's his greatest work for voice, his greatest piece of chamber music, certainly piano trio, his most important violin sonata, his most important piano sonata, take your pick, 106 or 111, would be in most people's top lists. So all of this were dedicated to the same man. So in conclusion, I want to say that about this man that Susan Kagan, who is an author who has studied his life and his music, and to whom I'm much indebted in this evening's presentation, she asks, how highly should we rate his music? Quote, perhaps the most compelling answer to the question posed above is provided by Beethoven's role in overseeing Rudolph's creative output. Beethoven's interest in Rudolph as a composition student could perhaps be regarded merely as attributable to the debt he owed to Rudolph's patronage. However, the amount of time and attention Beethoven lavished on Rudolph, the meticulous critical corrections to refine his work, and Beethoven's comments to others praising the Archduke's talent, and his actions on behalf of publications of his music, all these suggest that Beethoven had true faith in the ability of his student. So the person, unquote, the person who emerges before us, this person is a man full of earnest purpose, it seems to me, a composer of studious inventiveness, a fine craftsman, and put simply, a pupil worthy of Beethoven, if such a thing were possible. We know, by the way, from several of Beethoven's letters, that the Archduke's name day was the 17th of April, today. And this is not even our brilliant presenter, Irina Knoster, could have arranged this. This is pure happenstance, or maybe, perhaps, Providence belatedly rendering this Serenissimus Rudolphus Dux a part of his due. Enough talking. You've been wonderful to listen. I will leave and get my violinist, and we will together play Opus 96 Sonata, and then intermission, and then Opus 97 Trio. Thank you very much.